want to talk about anti-Zionism. So people will remember the discussion, I think, about hyphens. So some time ago, people decided that we would rather not write anti-Semitism with a hyphen, because the hyphen implies that there is a Semitism against which anti-Semites define their worldview. And there is no Semitism. There are Jews. Jews are diverse and infinitely diverse, in fact. And the insight was that the Jews against which anti-Semites developed a worldview or an ideology were invented by themselves. They were self-invented. So we use one word, anti-Semitism, to describe that ideology, which sets itself up against a notion of Jews that it has itself invented. So what we're talking about today is anti-Zionism. And you'll see that there is no hyphen. And there's a reason for that. And the reason is the same reason. The reason is that the Zionism against which anti-Zionism defines itself is invented by itself. So I want to go through some issues actually and discuss some things, and I will try to keep coming back to that question about the nature of anti-Zionism as an ideology that defines itself in relation to a Zionism that has very little connection to the actual world. For years, we've been asking the question, when does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism, or when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism? And I'm kind of bored of answering that question. And I think that perhaps we need to start thinking of it in a different way. So if anti-Zionism is an ideology which defines itself in relation to the state of Israel or in relation to the political self-organization of Jews, then in a sense, anti-Zionism, or there is an anti-Zionism which predates the state of Israel. The protocols of the Elders of Zion themselves were written partly as a response to and in a panic about the Basel Congresses. And there were panics about Jewish political self-organization before that too, in the late 19th century. So wouldn't that be interesting if the question wasn't, when does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitism, but if the question was, how did anti-Zionism, sorry, the other way around. No, I'm getting confused now. When does anti-Zionism become anti-Semitic? But perhaps there's a question that we could ask the other way around, which is, in the 20th century, how did anti-Zionism lead to anti-Semitism? Not the other way around. How was anti-Zionism prior to 20th century anti-Semitism altogether? Now, clearly, there was a pre-1948 anti-Zionism, or I should say, perhaps more accurately, a pre-war, a pre-Holocaust, and a pre-War of 1948 anti-Zionism, which was not an ideology built around an invented notion of Zionism, but which was a political movement that engaged with and criticized Zionism. This existed, There were arguments amongst Jews in the early 20th century, and actually there were basically arguments amongst radical and left-wing Jews. Some of them were Bundists, and some of them were Bolsheviks and communists and socialists, and some of them were Zionists. And the radical movements to deal with anti-Semitism, there were debates about which people should adopt. There were, of course, other strategies, one of which was just to emigrate, to get out of, for example, Eastern Europe and get into Western Europe or the United States of America. There was another, which was to assimilate, to say, all right, we don't want to be Jewish anymore. And of course, you will have noticed somebody out there will be kind of already shouting at their screen saying that's a particularly Ashkenormative way of thinking about Zionism, because I'm talking about people in Russia and in Eastern Europe, which is also true. And it's also true, actually, that I'm not familiar with the debates that were happening in the Middle East at the time, and that would be interesting to find out, and perhaps I should be. So there was an anti-Zionism, which was a legitimate engagement with a political program of Zionism. It was a critique of it. But there was also, and I think I've changed my position a little on this, because I used to say that anti-Zionism as an ideology emerged after 48, after the Holocaust, after the war of 1948, and then after the expulsion of Jews from the great cities of the Middle East. And then anti-Zionism took on a different meaning, because it became not a criticism of a political movement, but it became a program for trying to wind back history, or trying to undo the work that, to use a kind of Marxist phraseology, the work that history had already done. And that is an interesting issue to me, the distinction between the criticism of a movement and the program to take down, to destroy a nation which has come to exist. And it's important, actually, because my own methodology in sociology, and actually the methodology that I was brought up with in Marxism, begins with the material world. It begins with the world, not with ideas about the world. And so if you want to understand Zionism, you look at how Zionism actually played out in the world, where it came from, why it came, what were the material changes in Europe and in the Middle East, which led to the creation of the State of Israel. You don't just go back to Herzl and ask, was it a bad idea? And is Israel always and forever the playing out of a bad idea in the material world? But I'll come back to that too. Lev, help me here. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Okay, great. So I want to start talking a little bit about racism and race. And it is to my eternal sadness, actually, that whenever I do a talk on anti-Semitism, there is always something completely fresh to talk about. There's always something from this week. Everywhere I go, whenever I speak, there is something from this week, and this week's issue perhaps has been this. This was a book written by Karen Brodkin published in 1998. Was it that late? I think it was. The title of the book was How Jews Became White Folks, and what that says about race in America. And my feeling is, reading that book, that it's actually politically quite a naive book. It doesn't really think through the consequences and the meaning of defining Jews as white. What it does is it is a kind of sociological approach which looks at some of the changes that have happened in Jewish communities and in the cities, and tells the story about the whitening or the upward mobility of Jews in relation to African Americans. And for sure, that is a story that should be told, and that is interesting. But I want to talk a little bit about what flows from the idea that Jews became white folk. And people may have seen some of the controversy over the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League's adoption of a new definition of racism. And what it does is it ties racism to two things. One is to a kind of global structure of power, and the other is to a color binary. Now, it's kind of the first thing anyone ever asks when, I don't know, you know, when you're 9 years old or 11 years old and you say, what is racism? And somebody says, well, racism is when you're mean to somebody on the basis of, you know, the color of their skin or whatever. And then somebody else will say, well, hang on, that's not quite right, because racism isn't just one person being mean to another person on the basis of their skin color or things like that, but it's also a social structure, and it's quite a big and long-lasting social structure, which is quite important to many, many things in the world that exist today. So when people say to you, well, can black people be racist against white people? The answer, you know, always given when you were 11 was no, black people cannot be racist against white people. They can be mean to white people, they can bully white people, they can, you know, make a white kid's life miserable at school, but that would not be racism. That would be something, actually a form of bullying which has a whole different history and a whole different structure. In other words, that form of bullying would not be part of a global social structure. So that was one of the things about this definition. And the other thing, of course, is that it ties it not only to underlying social structures in general, but specifically to the color binary. So racism becomes about black and white. And people would have seen the discussion that Whoopi Goldberg got involved in, talking about the Holocaust. And actually what she wanted to say about the Holocaust was fine. She was talking about how awful it was and how we should take it seriously. But she got into a discussion with, her name is Ana Navarro on TV, and she ended up saying, quote, "But it's not about race, it's about man's inhumanity to man." The idea that the Holocaust is kind of just another incidence of man's inhumanity to man, in other words, is kind of ordinary and normal, is kind of controversial. But I don't really want to get into that discussion directly, but I'm more interested in what came next. So the response was, but it's about white supremacy. It's about going after Jews and Gypsies and Roma. And Whoopi Goldberg said, but these are two white groups of people. This is white people doing it to white people, so you're gonna fight amongst yourselves. Now, clearly the idea that the Holocaust could be described in terms of two groups of white people fighting amongst themselves is also quite unpleasant because the Holocaust was not a kind of equal fight between two groups of people, but I don't really want to get into that either because that's kind of obvious, and I've no doubt that when she stopped and thought about that, she realized what was going on there. But I am interested in the idea of whiteness, or put it this way, the idea that the Holocaust was not racist, that the anti-Semitism of Nazi Germany was not racist, and by the way, the anti-Zionism, the genocide against people who are called gypsies or Roma, was also not racist. And that's something that is worth thinking about, I think. So there has been a kind of common sense notion in the post-Holocaust period that people who opposed anti-Semitism and people who opposed racism were clearly on the same side, and they were involved in the same campaign. This is how Frantz Fanon articulated it. He said it was my philosophy professor who recalled the fact to me one day, whenever you hear anyone abuse Jews, pay attention, because he is talking about you. And I found, says Fanon, he was universally right, by which I meant that I was answerable for what was done to my brother. Later, I realized that he meant, quite simply, an anti-Semite is inevitably anti-Negro. So Fanon and his professor actually articulate a slightly different understanding of the relationship, but it's a kind of very straightforward one, which says that it's about the universality of humanity, isn't it? It says, sorry, of course it is, that's what he says specifically. It says, we are all human beings, and when you divide human beings into groups who you say have less value or are dangerous or have less rights, fewer rights, then you're doing something wrong, and it's simply a question of human solidarity.
I'm going to close the line.
No.
So, sorry, is somebody talking? No, okay. So that notion of race, the kind of archetypically American notion, the notion that Whoopi Goldberg had in her mind, it works if you're thinking about the ways in which Jewish people may not be, stopped in their car in driving down a street in the United States because they don't look black. Although, of course, lots of Jews do look black, but perhaps not so much in America. But anyway, you can understand there is an idea that in a context in which black people are particularly targeted, then it's perfectly possible that Jews would not be. But with that notion of racism, you then have to say, well, then the Holocaust wasn't racist, or you have to say, for example, the genocide in Rwanda, when Hutu people or a Hutu movement defined Tutsi people as being cockroaches, as being unworthy to live, was not based on racism. I mean, it's a defensible position. You can go back and you can say, well, clearly something awful was happening and something kind of similar to racism was happening, and certainly there was a power imbalance, but we should say the idea of race, or this global binary between black and white. And then there's a question that can be asked about the splitting of Jews themselves into white and non-white Jews. So on the one hand, you know, some Jews can pass very well as white when they're driving their car down the street and there's a racist cop on the prowl, or when they walk into a job interview and there's a racist interviewer, and they may well pass as white. Although when the cop or the interviewer sees your name, they might not think that you pass as white anymore, or if they see your kippah, or if they decide that the shape of your nose or the curliness of your hair is something that defines your value as a human being. So there's a kind of political response to anti-Semitism, really, which says, no, we're all Jews and we are targeted together as Jews by anti-Semitism, and not individually or split off as white Jews and black Jews. On the other hand, of course, it's also true that there is racism amongst Jews, and there is a color binary, and there is a power difference amongst Jews. So these are kind of difficult discussions which, you know, we can kind of work through. And in the end, by the way, it seems to me that the questions, you know, is anti-Semitism a kind of racism? There's so much heat in the questions, but the answers are really a little bit elsewhere. And I would always want to ask, well, what's at stake in the question? What is important in the question? And it seems to me actually that there are people who take anti-Semitism very seriously, who think that it is so serious that it should be categorized as a racism. And there are people who don't take anti-Semitism very seriously and who think that it should only be understood to be a racism amongst many with no particularities and no uniqueness. And why are the Jews always complaining so much about their particular thing? Why don't they get back in the queue? And the same goes on the other side of the debate. There are people who say that anti-Semitism is so serious that it is not only an ordinary racism. And there are other people who say that anti-Semitism isn't like racism at all, because it's not an oppression at all, that in fact Jews are part of the white and privileged class of human beings. So by fighting it out over is anti-Semitism a form of racism, you're not really getting to the heart of the issue. So let's move on a little bit. This is an interesting story that I want to tell you. So what I've kind of thought about this quite a lot recently. I used to tell first year students, right, when we talk about racism, I'm a sociologist, so my task is to show students about the social construction of race. And the common sense notion, of course, is, well, race is not socially constructed, but it's natural. People look different. And the way I always did this was to say that there is an infinite diversity amongst human beings, but some kinds of diversity and some kinds of biological markers which are insignificant in themselves or inherently are given huge social power, social significance. And that is race. Race is the assigning of social significance to particular kinds of biological differences. And of course, well, there's no of course about it. Gender can be described in a kind of similar way, in the sense that there are certainly differences between human bodies, and people will argue about the way we should understand the ways that bodies cluster, in other words, into male and female. But the point of gender, of course, is that gender is the social significance and the whole raft of social norms and shared meanings that come with certain kinds of bodies. But both of these things actually are, in fact, slightly more complicated. So if you go back and look at the Holocaust and you go back and look at the Nazis, you will see that Jews were indeed defined as a race and as a kind of specifically terrible, dangerous race. The Nazis were specifically obsessed by Jews, right? It's not the Jews who come along later and say, well, you know, the Holocaust was really important, and the Jews, the most important people in the Holocaust. It was the Nazis who had an obsession with Jews, and it was the Nazis who wanted to search the whole world in every house and in every forest and find the Jews and wipe them out. And the way, actually they made the case in many ways, but one of the ways they made that case was racialization. They said that Jews are a race. And they got their scientists to sit down and draw pictures of Jews with big noses and Jews with curly hair and this, that, and the other. So going back to my sort of first year sociology description of race, there are specific kinds of physical differences that are given huge social significance. That wasn't true with Jews. I mean, you know, there might be certain kinds of physical associations or clusters around certain subgroups of Jews. You know, Ashkenazi Jews have certain kinds of illnesses, for example. But Hitler was not racializing Ashkenazi Jews. Hitler was racializing Jews. And in order to do that, he had to create a physical distinction, a race, out of nothing. So there was no basis at all in you know, biology or anything like that for the racialization of Jews. The Jewish race was created only in terms of social significance and social meanings and social constructions. And of course, the second question that everybody asks, if you tell them that race or gender is socially constructed, they say, oh, so it's not real then. We can just kind of, you know, make it not exist because it's not real. And of course, the truth is it's real. It had huge and important and material consequences for Black people in America and for Jews and for women. So to then say that socially constructed things are not real is wrong. Or at least this is a kind of, anyway, this is one of the key insights of sociology, I think. So let me tell you this story about David Unterhalter. It's a very simple story. He was recently, last year, nominated for the Constitution Court of South Africa. You will remember that the South African Constitution was written in 1993 and 4, I think, by very interesting and smart people, actually, to replace the apartheid constitution. And they set up a constitutional court, which would be like the Supreme Court in the United States or in Britain, for example. So David Unterhalter was nominated. He was a judge, and he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And the boycott campaign, the BDS campaign in South Africa, decided that they would oppose his nomination, and they opposed his nomination on the basis that he had been a member of the Jewish Board of Deputies of South African Jews. And they said the Jewish Board of Deputies of South African Jews is a Zionist organization, and they said Zionism is apartheid and Zionism is racism. And they said, therefore, this man who has been a member of this racist organization is fundamentally in violation of the values of our country, South Africa, and he's also fundamentally in violation of the norms of the legal profession. And so he should not be a judge on the Supreme Court. Now, the truth of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies is that it is a broad communal body of the Jewish community in South Africa. It has deputies from synagogues and from Jewish NGOs and from all kinds of Jewish organizations. and it sits together and it discusses and debates, and it tries to represent the Jewish community in South Africa. And yeah, it is Zionist. So what we have there is a very simple kind of, you know, A follows B follows C. The complexity, of course, is that whereas BDS might say that Zionism is apartheid and racism, I might not. And the Board of Deputies might not, and the overwhelming majority of Jews who have some kind of relationship with the State of Israel, some kind of positive relationship with the State of Israel, do not think of themselves as racists. And that's because they're not racists. Of course, some Jews are racist, that's, you know, there you go, but it's not, and of course some Zionism, some histories of Zionism, some very marginal parts of the Zionist movement have been racist. And of course, that is something which defines Zionism in Israel not as unique, but as the same, the same as every other nationalist tradition that I know about. So what I'm interested in here is how do I define my own Zionism? Generally, I don't go around defining myself as a Zionist, actually, and I haven't for many, many years. And the reason I don't is because I feel that it's an irrelevant question to the question of whether I should be disallowed from serving on the Supreme Court. If somebody says to me, you're a Zionist, therefore you're a racist, therefore you can't be on the Supreme Court, or in my case, perhaps you can't be a sociology lecturer, then I will not say, my Zionism is fine. My Zionism is not racist. My Zionism is, you know, this and that tradition. I will say, you have imposed a Zionist identity onto me, which is about what you believe it to be, and it's not about me. And I think that's true of me personally, and I think it's true of the overwhelming majority of Jews who have some kind of relationship, positive relationship with the State of Israel, and a whole diversity of relationships. I mean, you know, some Jews are very taken by the fact that the place names that they read in the Torah every Shabbat in Shul are the place names in Israel. And they are very taken by the fact that their tradition comes from that place. And other Jews are very taken by the fact that Israel was built as a life raft for the Jews, or other people are very taken by the Declaration of Independence, which guarantees Israel as a democracy and a place where everybody has equal rights. And other people are very taken by the militancy with which Israel defends the right of Jews to live without being attacked by people who have, in one way or another, adopted the wish to stop Jews from living. So all kinds of Zionism and and I kind of want to say, well, there are different kinds of Zionists, but actually most Jews are all those kinds of Zionists kind of rolled into one, and it depends what their mood is at a particular moment. And some Jews believe that their Zionism drives them to be really critical of some of the things that the Israeli government does. So when BDS comes along and says, you cannot be a sociologist because your inner values are in violation of the values of sociology, you cannot be an elected representative in Britain or a judge in Britain because your values violate British values, then I can see something else going on. And what I can see is the construction of Jews against their will and without their collusion and without their participation, the construction of Jews as something bad. And it seems to me that that is quite interestingly analogous to the construction of race in the first place. And of course, you know, lots of people will say, look, I mean, I'm sure lots of Black people and the whole history of Black consciousness and you know, said, I'm Black and I'm beautiful and I embrace my identity as being Black and it's great and I love it and don't tell me I'm not Black. Don't tell me it's just a social construction or whatever. That's fine. But what's not fine is when people's identities are defined for them and in a hostile way and from outside and without their participation. And it seems to me that this was done to David and Suharto in South Africa. And he did not, he does not serve on the Supreme Court, the Constitution Court. And that seems to me that that way of thinking about Zionism and that construction of Zionism, independently of the real ideas and feelings and traditions that are in people's minds, and independently of the actual complex tradition of what happens in Israel, that way of constructing Zionism is a way which alienates and excludes Jewish people. Now you might say, well, it's not Jews, but Zionists. And if he hadn't sat on the board of Jewish deputies, he wouldn't have been excluded. It's true that BDS sets up a way for exceptional Jews to be treated exceptionally. But the way that is open to Jews is to accept the specific definition and wording that is offered to them and to, I mean, fine, if that's your view, then that's your view, but it doesn't ask Jews what their Zionism is. It tells them that their Zionism is evil unless they disavow it. And in those circumstances, I think most Jews will not choose to disavow. There's an interesting little history in South Africa, of course, that Izzy Maisels, for example, was one of the lawyers who defended Nelson Mandela in the treason trial, had been the chair of the Board of Deputies, therefore had been a Zionist in the definition offered by BDS. And he defended Nelson Mandela very well, and he was found not guilty. So there is clearly another history to Zionists in South Africa. This was a quote from Luciana Berger, who was a Labour MP until she was drummed out of the Labour Party by an anti-Semitic movement, which was had grown in the Labour Party at the time of the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn. And she said this to the newspaper. She said, "I never thought I would be described on the news as a Jewish MP. I thought I was a Labour MP." And that seems to me the kind of archetypal story of exclusion, which happens to Jews. And it was the story of Alfred Dreyfus, who never wanted particularly to be a Jewish army officer, but he wanted to be a French army officer, and he was a very good army officer, and he was a modernizing army officer, and he was designated as Jewish by his colleagues in the officer corps in the French army. Similarly, so this is how Jews get constructed in their identity against their will. And that kind of anti-Zionism, which does that, which constructs Jews as being not only white, but white supremacist, not only white, but racist, not only white, but the the very worst, actually. The kind of the people who create in the Middle East a kind of keystone of a whole system of imperialism, and who defend and uphold it, a system which becomes symbolic of everything bad in the world, a system which is said to develop everything bad in the world, a system which is said to, which takes on a kind of universality. I'm being told that I do not have much time left, so I'm going to skip over about 1,000 lovely slides. And I'm going to find a couple to end with. So I'll go to the next one here. And I'm very happy actually to have plenty of time for discussion. Now I won't go to that one. I will go to, no, not that one either. Give me a minute. This one. This is one of my favorites. So I'm talking about anti-Zionism when it becomes an ideology, when it becomes a way of understanding not only the conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinians, not only the problem in the West Bank, not only the struggle for freedom and democracy and rights of Palestinians under Israeli occupation, but it comes to be an ideology which explains everything. Hannah Arendt talked about anti-Semitism as being an ideology which makes Jews into the key to history. That the world is unintelligible until you understand the Jews and their central place in it, and you turn the key and the door opens, and then you understand history. The Jews are the key to history. So let me read you this quote from a guy who was an academic in the United States, Stephen Slater. He said this: Zionism is part and parcel of unilateral administrative power. It lends itself to top-down decision-making, to suppression of anti-neoliberal activism, to restrictions on free speech, to colonial governance, to corporatization and counter-revolution. In other words, he says, Zionism behaves in universities precisely as it does in various geopolitical systems. Which is, of course, in this story, precisely as it does in the West Bank and in Gaza and in Israel in oppressing the Palestinians. So a particular conflict which exists between Israel and the Palestinians is then universalized and made into the key to history. It's made into the center of everything bad in the world, and it's made into something that is symbolic of everything bad in the world. And it is a global universal ideology, and it is centered on opposition to the overwhelming majority of Jews in the world. So, is that anti-Semitic? Well, you know, on one level, who cares? On one level, there have been a whole number of anti-Jewish ideologies and anti-Jewish movements that have challenged Jews. I'll finish with this, actually, that there's this, there's kind of two ways of thinking about this long history of anti-Semitism. There's the kind of David Nirenberg way. David Nirenberg writes this amazing, scholarly, big, thick book, which tells the story of 30 centuries of anti-Jewish movements, and he tells them as though it was one story. And of course, it's perfectly understandable when you're Jewish that if some, you know, if you get defined as being in violation of the values of your country and kicked off the Constitution Court, you're going to understand that in relation to that long history. On the other hand, Hannah Arendt warns against it, and she says we need to be very clear about the differences between these different movements. You know, the Spanish Inquisition and Nazi Germany, and the blood libel in Lincoln in 11, whatever it was, and Stephen Slater on a campus in America in the 21st century. These are very different places with very different social systems and different social agents. So for her, she says, you mustn't think of anti-Semitism as just something that's out there in the air or in reservoirs or it's a kind of monster under the sea that keeps poking up new heads. You must think of the people who embrace it and pick it up. And different people in different social situations pick it up and embrace anti-Jewish ideologies because they do some work for them. And why are they all similar? I think one could start thinking about the similarity, for example, in terms of a kind of evolution. That some of these elements of anti-Jewish ideas and feelings are evolved within similar kinds of political movements, similar kinds of movements, to try to give a face to that which we cannot deal with and we cannot defeat, and that which we are afraid of. And the 20th century totalitarians constructed Jews as the enemy of the people, as the people who were behind the forces that made society awful and that made people miserable. And constructing Jews as the enemy of the people worked for them because there was this long prehistory of emotional attachments around these anti-Semitic notions and tropes and stories about Jews. And so Israel, for example, it works. It works as the key to history. It works as an explanation of everything bad in the world. It works as something that is symbolic of all evil, but it works for people today who pick it up, who put it together, and who remake something new with fragments that they find lying around. So it's for Hannah Arendt, I think it's about agency. It's not just this thing that has happened all through history, but people pick it up and they make an anti-Jewish ideology anew for reasons which are related to the world that they live in and not the world of St. Paul or the world of the Spanish Inquisition, what have you. I want to, oh, there you go. Jews as the key to history. I want to finish by paying a very short tribute to Todd Gitlin, who was a sociologist at Columbia from the United States, who died this weekend. He was a leader of the American left. He was a leader of the student movement against the Vietnam War. He was the president of Students for a Democratic Society in 1963 and 64. And I got to know Todd Gitlin a little bit in his later years. And one of the ways I got to know Todd Gitlin was that he was very, very sharp. Well, he was very sharp on many things. And one of the things that he was sharp on was anti-Semitism. And for me, that made him quite special as somebody who identified very strongly with the left and who came out of that left and anti-imperialist tradition. I sat with him a number of times on the Upper West Side, telling him stories from Britain and talking things through with him. So I don't give you this quote to big myself up. Well, I do a little bit, I guess, but he was a good man. There you go. You can find me on Twitter and Facebook. You can find my Goldsmiths homepage, which has links to lots of things I've written. You can read my book, and you can look out for developments with the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, which we are building. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much for that talk. It was so fascinating. I'm gonna kick us off with the first question. So you spoke about the social significance ascribed to race and this particular feature of bodily difference. And I was wondering if you could please unpack about the significance of capitalism in ascribing some of that weight and the ebbs and flows in relation to anti-Zionism as an ideology. So the significance of capitalism in this.
Well, Chloe, that's a big question. So there are lots of debates about race and where race came from and where racism came from. And the argument really is that in the world we live in, this kind of central binary, which was fundamentally between Europe and the rest of the world and between white and not white, came to dominate. And it came to dominate in relation to modernity, or in relation to the system that Marx called capitalism. And it came to dominate in relation to modernity and capitalism in ways that people debate. So people debate whether there was racism already, and that enabled or encouraged people to build a system of colonialism and slavery, or whether colonialism and slavery was a kind of economic imperative, which then needed some kind of justification so that we wouldn't feel so bad about it in Europe. The interesting thing about that is that it sets up, so that framework puts that single power binary kind of at the heart of everything, really, at the heart of race thinking. And that's at the heart of the idea of the ADL definition, which says that racism is about the domination of white people. And so, for example, within that framework, people might relate to the Hutu and Tutsi conflict, genocide, not in relation to a kind of Hutu racism against Tutsi, but in relation to the social construction of Hutu and Tutsi by the Belgian and German colonialists and by the system of colonialism which privileged, which constructed and privileged Tutsi, it is said, over Hutu. And so the racism involved in even the Rwanda genocide in 1995, decades after Rwanda and Burundi had their independence, that can be then traced back to well, really the root of all evil, which is colonialism. So there's many things to say about that. One of them is that anti-Zionism takes that binary system and attaches Israel to the root of all evil, which is colonialism. And it attaches Israel to it in a kind of central position, an important position, a symbolic position, or even a leadership position. There are people who say that Israel kind of directs the United States to go to war and things like that. There's another important issue to unpack inside of that, which is at the time of the rise of colonialism and the emergence of racism as a system of thinking about people outside of Europe from within Europe, anti-Semitism was on the rise at the same time. Anti-Semitism within Europe, in relation to an enemy within, was on the rise through the 18th and 19th centuries at the same time, and linked to the rise of the idea of an enemy without. So that then links anti-Semitism and racism in all kinds of possibly interesting ways, but it doesn't really answer our question, because it might show us that anti-Semitism as a kind of internal other is very different, or it might show us that they emerged at a similar time, and then anti-Semitism emerged in relation to the emergence of nationalism and nation states in Europe. There are many, many things to say, I think, but I think I've said some of them.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so we have some questions from the audience.
I need my glasses then.
Yeah, I can read it.
Okay.
Everybody can hear. So Joseph Freeman asks, as a Jew born in the UK, and Steven Gershoff asks, can we devise a combined term which interrelated anti-Semitism, anti-Israelism, and anti-Zionism using the acronym of ASAIAZ, since the perpetrators of each themselves seldom care which of the three they're hating, protesting, or welcoming. That is why we don't usually dissociate the anti-Semites from the anti-Israelis and the anti-Zionists. All have a very similar delusion expressed by a focus and hatred towards the combination of the ASAIAZ.
I'm trying to work out how one would pronounce that that new word, but I'm not going to try to pronounce it. Look, I think I've never really loved the term anti-Israelism for exactly the reason that I've tried to spell out in this talk, actually, which is that the Zionism that anti-Zionism defines itself in relation to has very little to do with Israel at all. Unterhalter in South Africa was not prevented from going on the South African Supreme Court by South Africans, and he is also South African, because of Israel. This was all something happening within South Africa. And so I've never particularly liked the term anti-Israel, because also because anti-Zionism refuses the existence of Israel. They prefer to call it, the Zionist entity or the, and the reason they do that is very simple. It's because sorry, I was involved with trying to explain to somebody about a particular tweet from George Galloway, and discussing whether that was anti-Semitic, and he seems to be in the habit of spelling Israel with a kind of I don't know what it's called in French, like an umlaut over the E. It's a French spelling, and we were trying to work out. I've done this on Facebook actually too. Why Galloway spells Israel wrongly? Why does he kind of misname Israel on purpose? And I think one of the compelling reasons is because he cannot bear to use the name Israel properly. And the reason for that is because he's for smashing Israel. And anyone can be an opponent of a political movement. You can say that a political movement is wrong, or you can say an idea is wrong. And you can be, against a movement and want your movement to win out. But how can you be against a nation that exists? You can't. Nobody is anti-French in the sense of wanting to sort of destroy France and annihilate it. So anti-Zionism isn't really anti-Israelism, I think. And the question, look, I'm not going to tell people to stop saying that what happened to David Unterhalter was anti-Semitic, because it was anti-Semitic. He was excluded from the Constitution Court. or at least the argument by which people wanted him. I mean, maybe he didn't win because of other reasons, but that's, again, the nature of racism is you never know why you didn't win, right? Either it was because you were an evil supporter of apartheid, or maybe you just weren't a good enough lawyer, and you will never know. Sorry, that was a little detour. But my point is that this way of thinking about anti-Zionism, I think, might tell us something. It's not that I want to insist that we have to stop saying that things that are anti-Semitic are anti-Semitic, but it also relies on an idea that anti-Semitism itself was a kind of specific, kind of weird 19th century anti-Jewish ideology. It's sort of invented by Wilhelm Marr and other people like that. And if you think of anti-Semitism in that way, then there are many, many anti-Jewish movements, and then it kind of makes sense to think of anti-Zionism as one of them. But hey, I don't want to get too hung up on words and arguments over words for the same reason that I mentioned earlier on about anti-Semitism and racism, because what we need to think about always is what is at stake in these discussions, and what are the important things that we are fighting for when we fight over words.
Yeah, okay, thank you. And I think we have just enough time for one last question. And I think that the question of the younger generation from Robin Woodley might suit us. And he asks, do you think the horrific Zionism is racism? The charge may have gone over people's head, but the apartheid lie seems to resonate with a generation who seems to have lost the ability to grasp complexities.
Sorry, I didn't quite understand. The Zionism is racism idea has been replaced by Zionism is apartheid? Is that the question?
Yeah.
Well, I would have thought it was precisely the same, really, given that apartheid is racism. But, you know, the history of that idea is, it kind of runs through many, many anti-Semitisms. There are many anti-Semitic readings in the history of anti-Semitism of the notion of the chosen people, right? The notion that the Jews, so it's quite interesting, right? Christianity was a kind of universalization, right? It took Judaism and it made a kind of quite a simple universal good news out of it. And people argue that that impelled Christianity then to go and sort of take over the whole world because they knew the truth, and the truth was universal and for everyone. And I think that's probably a kind of vast oversimplification of Christianity and missionaries and colonialism, all the rest of it. But by the opposite token, if you like, Judaism was accused of not being universal, and Judaism was accused of thinking that, you know, being the religion only for a small tribe, and for having this notion of the chosen people by which the small tribe was better. So this idea of Jewish supremacy, of Jews thinking they're better than everyone else, it goes back a long way. Better than everyone else, cleverer than everybody else, right? Everyone else realized that Jesus was the Messiah, but the Jews were stubborn and they were too clever by half, and they thought they knew it all, right? So the idea of Jews being like that is old. The specific Zionism is racism idea already emerged in anti-Zionism at the time of the protocols. It emerged with great ferocity in Soviet propaganda in the 1950s and through into the 60s. I learned recently, actually, from my colleague Isabella Tabarovsky, that Soviet propaganda was particularly concerned about the Eichmann trial in the early 60s, because the Eichmann trial told some truth about the Holocaust, which the Soviet authorities had been trying to tell differently. So where was it? Was it Baba Yar in Ukraine, where there was a plaque to memorialize the killing there, which said, here were killed 30,000 Soviet citizens, something like that. Which takes us back to the beginning of the talk, actually, with the idea that anti-Semitism is just a racism, and we shouldn't really get too hung up about the Jewish nature of it. And that Zionism is racism was developed and pushed out by, you know, anti-Semitic Soviet propaganda machines. It was adopted as official policy of the UN in 1975. It was then pushed back, actually. It was pushed back, I think it was undone, reversed by the UN. I suspect it was something to do with 1989, but I'm not sure exactly when. And also the idea of Zionism as racism was pushed back during the 80s and the 90s at the time of the peace process. And I think the reason for that is that this idea that Zionism was racism, that Zionism was an evil in the world, was largely replaced by an idea that Israel might be able to make peace with its neighbors, and people were having all kinds of lovely fantasies of what a peaceful Israel and Palestine would look like. And then, as we know, the peace process collapsed finally for the moment, finally, in January 2001. And in September 2001, there was the Durban Conference Against Racism in South Africa, which kind of reheated the Zionism is racism tradition of the UN and pushed it out with all its delegates and its NGOs and its lawyers and its human rights people and the global anti-racist movement, and sent Zionism is racism back to every country. And then a week later in 2001 was 9/11, was the Al-Qaeda attack on the United States. So quite a symbolic moment, actually, the end of the peace process, the recreation of political left anti-Semitism, and then a kind of moment of Islamist political anti-Semitism too. And then the Zionism is racism idea has been building ever since, with the rise of the boycott movement, the academic boycott movement in 2004-05, which came out of Britain, and the BDS movement, which kind of superseded it, and until this story really until last May, when there was a very clear attempt to set up the idea that Zionism is apartheid, that Israel is apartheid, to set it up as an absolute truth, and to challenge everyone in universities and in other social spaces and other professions to put their name on that notion. That in the wording, I think I have a slide here if I'm still connected. I'm probably too late and everybody's gone home. There it is. This was the very simplest kind of, the very simplest form of loyalty test, and it went around on Twitter, and it was 2.5 lines long, and it said, I am an academic and I call for a free Palestine and an end to Israeli state's apartheid. So I say that Israel is apartheid, and I say that a free Palestine means getting rid of the apartheid system, destroying it. This is integral to both my moral worldview and my scholarship. In other words, if you don't believe that a free Palestine requires the dismantling of Israeli apartheid, then you are not a moral person and you are not a scholar. So it sets up a loyalty test, and of course the last 3 words are important: pass it on. Make sure everybody passes it on, challenge everybody. And then we will flush out the people who will not sign it and who will not pass it on and who will not put their names on the statements that say Israel is apartheid. And it seems to me that that was a moment, actually, in the kind of, one thing that we've noticed recently is that anti-Zionists seem to have very little fear, actually. They don't think that people will read this as a loyalty test. They don't think that the exclusion of David Unterhalter from the profound values of South Africa, they don't think that this stuff will get them into trouble. And I think part of the removal of fear is these kinds of loyalty tests that went round at the same time as the conflict in May 21 cemented the idea that Israel is apartheid, not only as a kind of possible opinion, but as the correct opinion. And anyone who gets trouble for denouncing Zionists or Jews who they say are Zionist as racists and white supremacists, anyone who gets into trouble for it knows that they can produce any number of statements from any number of universities, which not only said that this was an appropriate possible view, but it said it's true, as did Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International. And that seems to me to be a moment of escalation. And there are many moments of escalation. There's been no catastrophe, there's just been moments of this thing walking away from us step by step, I think. And it's this kind of step that seems to me to be significant. Thank you.
Great, David.